Dashing Dan's Olympic adventures for Aussie home loans who can deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital. It's a great pleasure to catch up with a man that went to one Olympic Games. He was a 21-year-old when he ran for Australia at probably the piece de resistance. If you're an athlete, you'd love to run in front of your home crowd or participate in front of your home crowd, whatever the sport is. We're talking of athletics for Kris McCarthy, who ran the 800 metres for Australia in Sydney. Kris, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Kris, what are your memories? I mean, it's 24 years ago now. Are they still vivid?
A bit of a blur. As you mentioned, I was only very young at the time, and at the time probably thought I'd have quite a few more Olympics in front of me. So it can be a bit of a blur when you look back so long ago, and it's hard to believe it's already 24 years since Sydney Olympics. That's crazy.
Yeah, the world has certainly moved on, hasn't it? I mean, you were 21. Do you feel you're a bit young to be competing in Sydney? Or, I mean, obviously at the time when you get an opportunity, you're not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. But in hindsight, was it a bit early for you?
Yeah, I did improve very, very quickly. At 18, I was not even really doing much running at all, and got selected within sort of 18 months, 2 years after taking the sport back up. So I don't know if I was too young, but I was probably at the best I was ever running was at that year in 2000. And was lucky enough to run at Sydney. It was just prior to my 21st birthday, so it was very surreal. In 1996, I was in year 11 at school and watching Michael Johnson run that famous 200 metres in Atlanta, and wasn't even really doing the sport at that time. So it was a very, very quick and a bit of a whirlwind to take it back up in about end of 97. And by 2000 to be selected was quite surprising. But despite being that young, I feel like I was probably had the element of naivety in a way. I'd never raced in front of a big crowd. I didn't have, all those expectations on me and that type of thing. So I did have that in my corner.
Did you know what to expect?
No. It was completely surreal, and I was running against people I'd only ever sort of seen on TV before. People like Wilson Kipketer, who was the world record holder at the 800 metres. So to all of a sudden be seeing them in real life and be about to compete against them was really, really strange. I guess for someone who's not into athletics, it'd be like having Michael Jordan as your childhood idol, and then all of a sudden you're in the NBA and might have the chance to line up against them. So for me, it was very, very surreal.
As you said, watching the Olympics in Atlanta 4 years earlier in 1996, year 11 at school, you weren't even doing the sport. You must have been a natural at it, Kris.
I didn't grow until I was a bit older. So when I was a kid, I did athletics, little athletics, and I was quite good under 9s through to about under 12s, and used to win state titles and things like that. However, didn't grow and didn't go through puberty till much later than all the other kids. So by the time I was sort of 14, 15, I was a long way behind everyone else and sort of gave up the sport and concentrated on boundary umpiring. Was lucky enough to go up to the VFL and umpire up there as a boundary umpire. So that was sort of my focus through my later teenage years. And it wasn't until I got to pretty much after high school that I grew and sort of filled out. And then at the age of 18, really, really improved.
Was there a light bulb moment regarding wanting to take the sport a bit more seriously? And when did you think, having taken it up so close to the Sydney Olympics, gee, I'm a chance here of actually representing Australia at home games?
There was a couple of times. I think one of them was there was the Australian University Games, and this would have been at the end of 1998. So I'd probably been back running for just over a year, maybe a year and a half, something like that. And I went to an Australian Catholic university, so we didn't really have a team I just went down to the track at Olympic Park and entered my race and ran that. And I ended up winning that in quite a fast time and beating the World Junior representatives who went to the World Juniors the year before. And was very, very sick after the race because I hadn't done much training, so I was throwing up and on the ground for a good 20 minutes, half an hour afterwards. And my dad, who was coaching me at the time, was there, and he said, it's probably time to start actually training and taking this a little bit more seriously, having won that title. So that was probably a bit of a turning point. And one of the Olympic coaches actually came up to Dad and said, I know everybody. I don't know who he is. What's the story here? So, yeah, sort of just came from nowhere at that time, from 18 to about 20. To give you a bit of an idea, I guess, in terms of times, before my PB was about 2:09 for the 800 at 17. And by 20, I was running 1 minute 45. So probably what's a 26-second improvement in just over 2 years.
Any particular reason? As I say, you just must have been a natural. I mean, to shave the time off your PB in such a short space of time, I mean, that is an incredible performance. Did that surprise you, Kris?
Yeah, it was every time I went to the track, I was pretty much running PBs and big PBs. And I think it was a combination of growing and getting that bit taller and stronger, and also the fact I hadn't done any training. So I had the double benefit. I was growing and getting bigger and stronger at that later age, but at the same time, because I hadn't done training properly, you've got the added benefit of actually starting to train properly as well. So I think that's why I was taking such massive chunks off. When you are a novice at something and haven't really been doing it, you can improve a lot more quickly at the start. So that was probably to my benefit.
Middle distance runner Kris McCarthy is my guest today. It's great to have him with us. He ran the 800 metres at the Sydney Olympics back in 2000 on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures podcast. Thanks to Aussie Home Loans, I deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and capital as well, and they've got over 25 lenders. So when you were chosen, what was your initial feeling?
Relief. I performed really well in the summer of 2000 when we won the national title and performed really well in our Grand Prix season, and that's where I was running my qualifiers. But leading into the selection trials, which were in August in Sydney, I had my first real injury. So I tore my hamstring and tore it, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, tore it again. And that was heading into the selection trials. So I went into the selection trials really underdone, hadn't done much training for about 8 weeks beforehand, just slow jogging and water running and that type of stuff. In the selection trials, I didn't run that well, but luckily for me, there was only one other person with an A qualifier. I think I came maybe 4th or 5th in the selection trial. And I think the selectors looked at the fact that I had been injured, hadn't been training, and was the only other person they could actually select in the event. So I was very relieved to actually get the nod from the team.
So you're a little bit nervous, obviously, with the injuries that after flying earlier in the year, that the injuries had come at the worst possible time for you, Kris.
Yeah, and that was probably part of that inexperience, I guess, as well. Having only just started to really train properly, I hadn't experienced training and the levels, I guess. The first time I did my hamstring was it was a cold, I think June or July night in Sandringham, running a track there, and I was doing some speed work and probably running way too fast for how cold it was. And that was the first time I sort of injured my hamstring, and I was probably overdoing it a little bit in that regard, and probably not knowing, when I should be holding back and when I should be pushing. It was a bit of a nervous time waiting to hear from the selectors.
Did you have a personal coach? And if so, did that coach try and encourage you to maybe just pull it back a bit and look after the injury?
So my coach was my dad at the time. So he coached me in those first few years. And So he was learning along with me a lot of the time. He had a little bit of running background, but hadn't done any sort of serious coaching before. A lot of his background was watching horses and watching horse racing. So he sort of trained me a little bit like a horse. Did a lot of very fast, specific work. Didn't do as much endurance work and that type of thing. We're both sort of learning together as we went.
Kris McCarthy's joined me for Aussie Home Loans as part of our Olympic Adventures podcast for Dashing Down, and it's great to have him with us. He was participating in the Sydney Olympics in 2000 in the 800 metres. So to the race, there was a lot going on. There was a big crowd at the Sydney Olympic Stadium. How nervous were you?
Yeah, very, very, very nervous. On the morning of the race, you go down, you catch a bus down from the village. You have your breakfast there and then go down to the warm-up track. And because Australia had so many athletes and that competing, my dad couldn't get an actual one of the passes, a coach's pass to get into the warm-up area. So I had to go into the warm-up area by myself, which was pretty daunting considering I'm used to running down at my local track in front of maybe a couple of hundred people. And I think it was a sellout that day, somewhere around about 106,000 people in the stadium. So went into the warm-up area by myself, and that's where you're seeing all these, sort of legends of the sport. And you're just in there by yourself with your own thoughts, and you find yourself watching the world record holder warm up rather than doing your own warm-ups and that type of thing. From there, they take you into an area called the call room, where you basically just sit with all the other people that you'll be racing for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes. They get you in there pretty much an hour before you have to marshal, and they put you into your heat, and then you just sit there. And everyone's really nervous. Everyone's really, not quiet, not saying much. A lot of the athletes don't even speak the same language because they come from all around the world. And that's the least favourite place of my on earth. You just sit there, nervous as anything, waiting to get out there and start the race. And you're just sitting there, looking at your competitors. This is where you do things like put your bibs on and tie up your shoelaces, and my hands were shaking so much I couldn't get the pin through or tie the shoelaces up. So it was, probably the most nervous I've ever been in my life.
In that time, is that where, as you say, your least favourite time, waiting, 45 minutes before the race, that someone as young as you, as inexperienced as you in the big meetings, can play the race in your head too many times as to how you want it to be, as to what you're expecting, and by the time the race gets underway, your mind could be cooked?
Yeah, I think so. I remember like the night before I didn't get a very good sleep at all, maybe only an hour or two. It was a morning heat, which probably didn't suit me either. I think if it had been in the evening, at least you don't have to get up at a certain time. So if you don't fall asleep till 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., it doesn't matter because you can sleep in. But being in a morning heat and you've got to get up at 6 a.m., you're sort of watching the clock and, it's midnight, I haven't fallen asleep yet. It's 2 a.m., I haven't fallen asleep yet. So that starts to get into your head a little bit. I also had all the thoughts of the injuries because I hadn't had the ideal preparation. The 3 months leading in, even after the selection trials, I tore my hammy twice leading into the selection trials, but I tore it again once afterwards. So you've got all those sort of thoughts in your head. So I definitely approached the race a little bit negative, in a bit of a negative mindset. I remember in the World Championships in 2003, I was sitting in the call room next to the defending champion, a guy called Andre Boucher from Switzerland, and trying to do up my shoelace, and I was shaking and all nervous. And he was sitting next to me, and he said, "Man, I'm shitting myself. Why do we do this to ourselves?" And that was a bit of a wake up call for me because I'm nervous because I'm sitting next to the defending world champion, but he was just as nervous as me probably. And it was a bit of a wake up call that, it doesn't matter if you are the world record holder, the world champion, or, someone from one of the island countries that's, hasn't even done much racing, and they're getting that spot at the Olympic Games. Everyone's really, really nervous. So that was a good lesson. That came a little bit late for the Sydney Olympics, but that no matter how nervous you are, everybody else is usually feeling exactly the same.
Was it the same hamstring that you ripped 3 times, Kris? And if so, did you work out what the problem was?
It was. The first time I just came back a bit too quick. So, I think that the worry of the selection trials are coming up, I pushed and ran too fast too quickly after the first time. And having not had an injury before to my hamstrings, I probably didn't understand and felt that, it feels fine, I can go faster. It's still fine, it feels fine, I can go faster. And so I was probably running too close to top speed too quickly. So that's probably why it went the second time. And then once you've done it twice pretty close together and you're trying to get ready for the Olympics, you've obviously already got a bit of a weakness there. And so it is a real balancing act about how hard you can push without re-injuring it. And I guess it's not like other sports where, you tear a hamstring in round 3 at the AFL, you go, well, I can take 5 weeks, 6 weeks, get it right, I'll come back mid-season. You've got one race really to get it right for. You've got to be 100% ready to go by the Olympics. You don't really have the time to be waiting and go, I'll give it an extra 2 or 3 weeks, make sure it's 100% right. So you are really trying to find that balance between how hard I can push it without actually re-damaging it.
On Dashing Down's Olympic Adventures podcast, Kris McCarthy, who represented Australia in the 800 metres in Sydney in 2000, is my guest, and great to have him on board. Can I just go back to the selection trials? There's been an interesting story, controversial story in the last 24 hours with Lisa Weightman hoping to break a record and go to her 5th Olympic Games to represent Australia in the women's marathon. She's missed out, but her time was quicker than, of course, Jessica Stenson. Jess Tringove, before she got married, has picked up a spot. So they always take 3 representatives for the men and women's marathon, and Lisa's missed out. Do you think, and there's been a lot of talk, they should have a race-off. Do you think that there should be a race-off in the selection trials? And if you're the best 3 competitors, if that's what the rules are in regard to the events that you're meant to be competing in, that those competitors get to go? Or do you think, if, like in your case, and you probably deserve to go because that was the rules in place at the time, you got an A qualifying, that should still be taken into account?
The marathon's a tricky one because of the distance. When you're doing 100 metres, 800 metres, 1,500 metres, you can have the races and race off against each other, and you can race multiple times throughout the year. The marathon's difficult because it's such a long qualifying period. I think it extends out to nearly 2 years. So then it becomes really tricky. Is it the person who ran the fastest time, which may have done it 16 months ago, that you take, or do you take the person who ran just a little bit slower only a month or 2 ago? So all form and everything like that comes into it as well. The problem with the marathon in the past is that used to be really difficult to recover from. And usually people would only run 2 marathons a year. The marathoners, they make their money racing the street marathons all over the world. And, so to ask them to also, hey, you're going to run a marathon just around, Adelaide, between you to see which ones get to go, means that they're missing out on income as well. So it is a very, very tricky one. I have been told by a couple of the Australian marathoners that the new shoes, the super shoes, which you've probably heard all about,
yes, I have,
lately, do help them. Yep, they do help them recover a lot quicker, and that's why we're seeing athletes run a lot more marathons closer together. Right. It helps them recover from training, but also from the races. So I think there is definitely, and I think this is probably a great example, this particular case, there is definitely now the argument that maybe they do pick a big marathon 6 months out from the Olympic Games and say this is the qualifying. We've probably now got the depth to warrant it. In the past, this hasn't been an issue because we haven't had the same depth as what we've got this year.
It's certainly unfortunate for Lisa Weightman, which, again, for Athletics Australia, is a story that's sort of been covered in a negative light for them. So to your race, you're in the heats and the 800 metres. Were you confident of getting through, but was the mindset, as you mentioned a bit earlier, not where you wanted to be? And did you feel like you might have already been beaten because of the injuries as well?
Yeah, in the actual race, I ran really poorly tactically. I let myself get pushed around and things like that. And I think that was that little bit of a negative attitude that I went in with, those negative thoughts. Interestingly, I was in the last heat and I didn't need to run that quick to get through as one of the fastest qualifiers. And I was hoping that somebody might be able to give me a bit of an indication of what the time was, but you don't see the other heats when you're in the call room and things like that. You don't have an idea of what time you actually need to run to get through as a quite fastest qualifier. In the end, I think I finished fourth in my heat, I think it was, and I was only about 0.2 off being in one of the automatic qualifying positions and not very far off what the fastest qualifiers were getting through as well, and something that was well within my ability. I think you only had to run about 147 something to get through as the fastest qualifier, and my PB at the time was 145. So a little bit of information there would have been great, because I would have known that if I run 147, I'm probably going to get through as the fastest, and I'll go to the front and sort of push the pace along. But not knowing that, I sort of just ran a bit more of a negative race, sat back, let others dictate the race, and then tried to come home over the top. And when I found out I only missed out by 0.2 of a second, it was disappointing, knowing that, hey, you've gone into this race with a pretty negative attitude and you've only just missed out. If I'd been a bit more positive and ran a positive race, then things could have been a little bit different, even having coming back from the injuries.
How soon after the race, Kris, did you know you'd missed out?
I think probably pretty much straight away, because I was fourth.
Yeah.
You can get through as a fastest, but when we went over the line, I saw it wasn't a fast heat, and when you're running that it's not a fast heat. And I would have assumed that the time that you need to run to get through would have probably, as a fastest, probably would have been in the 145s. Right. And it wasn't. It was much, much slower than that. And that's where the information would have been handy. Hey, you're in the last heat. You run a 147, you're probably going to get through. It would have changed it from being a tactical race to, I would have probably gone to the front, pushed along the pace a bit and made sure that it was fast, so that 4 or 5 of us from that heat all got through. And in the end, it became a tactical sit and kick race, and I got out kicked. So, yeah. So I think from memory, I think I knew as soon as I went across the line that I probably wasn't going to advance.
Do you need, in a race like that, or just running generally in any competitive event, do you need to have a clear mind, or, as in your case, because it was the last heat, you're thinking about the time and you're thinking about the pace? Would it have been better for you if you were an earlier heat, maybe the first heat even?
It probably would have helped me if it was in a fast heat, because then you just sort of tack on and you run your race. You're running as hard as you can. The 800 metres being the shortest of the unlaned track events. 400, obviously, you run that in lanes. 800 is where the tactics really start to come in. And you see this a lot in the 800s and the 1500 metre races, where sometimes they'll be really quick heats and sometimes they'll be dead slow. And when it's dead slow and all the tactics come into it, that does make it challenging, because you're trying to position yourself. It's very much using some of my dad's terminology, being into the horse racing, like, running the Melbourne Cup. You got to be in a good position. You can have the best horse, but if the jockey starts up, you're not going to do any good. And that brings an extra element into it. When it's a fast race, it basically just comes down to how good your horse is. But when it's a tactical race, you need the jockey as well. So it does add another element when they are those slow tactical races, and that's what can make the Olympic Games so interesting, as opposed to your normal Grand Prix running, where they're just running for fast times and they have rabbits in and so pacemakers in. Pacemaker goes hard, everyone sits in single file and flows along behind the pacemaker, and it's whoever can run the fastest. when you get then down to the Olympic Games, you don't have those pacemakers, and so it changes everything, and it means that the tactics really does come into it. Basically, usually nobody usually wants to lead. That's why sometimes you'll get a really slow heat. Tamsin Lewis, now Tamsin Manu, used to be a famous front runner. She used to always go to the front and drive the pace, but not many athletes like to do that because you can be a bit of a sitting duck. So usually everyone wants to be about second or third, but also not trapped on the fence, because then you can't get out when it comes to the sprint finish. So there's a lot to sort of calculate while you're running in the 800 meters, and you don't have a long time to figure it out.
So how disappointed were you, or as time went on, were you happy as a 20-year-old so early in your career to have made an Olympic Games, thinking that this is just the start?
I was disappointed not to make it through, and it was hard because I felt like the injury really cost me, and I was improving so much at the time when I got injured. So it's hard to be disappointed in an injury, I guess, in a way. But the Sydney Olympic final was only 1 in 145, which was my PB at the time. It was a slower tactical race. Guys that I'd finished quite close to in the Australian summer, Sid Gurney, a guy from Algeria, he finished third in the race. So I felt like it was a real missed opportunity. But being 20 as well, I thought I had ages left in the sport, and I only ended up having about another 3.5 years before I got an ankle injury and didn't really run again. Had to withdraw from the Athens Olympics. I think it was the day before the opening ceremony with an ankle injury. So I was 24 at the time. But when you're 20, 21, 22, and you're improving so quickly, every time you run a PB, and you sort of think it's going to keep going. And so at that stage, I was disappointed, but I'm not going to reach my best at 28. I've got 8 more years before I get to my absolute peak. And that's sort of the thoughts you have. But it certainly didn't turn out that way in the long run.
So the ankle injury was that bad that you had to retire almost immediately. Are you able to explain what happened there? And as you say, on the eve of the Athens Games, when you were 4 years older, you'd had 1 Olympic Games under your belt. You finished third at the Commonwealth Games in 2002. So you probably were almost ready, weren't you, Kris?
Yeah, I was running quite well in 2004. I changed the way I trained and had moved from Dad no longer coached me, still sort of supported and came down and watched all the sessions, but I moved to Peter Fortune as coaching me. He started taking over in 2002, Peter Fortune. He was also Kathy Freeman's coach, so quite well credentialed. And we were approaching it from a different angle. So in 2000, as I said, Dad trained me a bit more like a horse, which was all this really high quality, fast work, but not a lot of longer endurance stuff. With Peter, I was doing a lot more reps and a lot longer stuff and building up that other side. So, for example, I think the session just before I got injured, I think we did 3,200 meter reps with a 30-second recovery in between. So quite different to what I was doing with Dad, which might be 6 200 meter reps with 2 or 3 minutes recovery, but doing them flat out. So we had changed training philosophies a little bit and felt that I had a lot more endurance and strength going into Athens. The ankle injury, I think it came back from an old mixed netball injury. I filled in for a mixed netball team once and jumped up and landed on someone's foot and did my ankle, and did it quite badly at the time, but didn't have surgery. So the ligaments went through a few of the ligaments, and I think that created a little bit of instability in my ankle. And once I started to increase the training loads, then it started to get sore in 2004. The issue was mainly that they couldn't find out what the problem was. So when I had bone scans, all my ankle was lit up like a Christmas tree. So I had all these bone reactions and stress reactions all in my ankle. And, we went and saw specialists, and one specialist said that, looks like there's no cartilage left in your ankle. So that's why you're getting all this bone reaction. And then another specialist said, but the gap spacing between the bones is good. So that indicates you have got cartilage left. And I had quite a few surgeries, and it just didn't quite seem to get better. And then it was about 2008 that another doctor, when looking at a scan, found a bit of floating bone. A bit of bone had broken off in my ankle and was basically sitting where it should be, but not attached. And then I had another surgery, and that might have actually ended up sort of fixing the problem, but I was a bit old by then to sort of come back. But yeah, so that might have been the overall issue, was that I had a little bit of floating bone in there that I didn't realise, and that might have been what was causing my pain. Generally what would happen was I could run sort of, 20 or 30K a week and be fine. As soon as I started to increase my volume, the ankle would get sore again. I'd get stress reactions and bone reactions, and I'd have to stop. So I did try to make a comeback for 06 Commonwealth Games and 2008 Olympics. And then after that's when we sort of found that bit of broken bone and had that removed. And haven't had a problem since, but yeah, the rest of my body was shot by then.
Kris McCarthy is my guest, 800-metre runner at the Sydney Olympics in 2000, and would have gone to Athens in 2004 if not for an ankle injury. Just on that, Kris, how disappointed were you that it wasn't discovered? And if it was floating bone, I always remember a long, long time ago, Gary Gilmore, a bit before your time, Australian cricket all-rounder, had floating bone in his foot, and it stopped him from having an effect, particularly bowling in the 77 centenary test. And he wasn't picked to go to England in 77, and they removed the floating bone, and he was fine after that. So your situation looks like it might have been very similar. How disappointed were you that the doctors weren't able to detect it quick enough to get you right for Athens?
Yeah, I think I made a mistake with my surgeon back in 2004. I went with a surgeon who could get me in straight away, and I wanted that to happen because the Australian team doctor, who I had great respect for, could still be there for my surgery and assist before flying over to meet with the Australian team for the Olympics. The surgeon who was the more renowned and better surgeon couldn't fit me in as soon, and so went with option one, and never really got back to running properly again. And so that was probably in the end a bit of a mistake. And have heard a couple of other athletes went to that same surgeon and they also didn't recover as well as they would have liked as well. So later on, as you get older in life, you sort of go, I've done this and I've done that. But there's also the other side of the coin as well. And so by getting those injuries, other aspects of my life came into play, which I wouldn't have ever had the opportunity to do had I kept on running. So yeah, you got to sometimes, I guess, try and look at the positives. And it was disappointing that my running ended earlier, but it did mean that I'm probably in a position now that I wouldn't have been had I continued to run.
We're here for Aussie Home Loans, areas of expertise for Aussie Home Loans around Australia: purchasing a property, owner-occupied or investment, building a property portfolio, refinancing, debt consolidation, cash out, construction, pre-approvals, first home buyers, equipment loans, car loans and personal loans. So what actually did you do once you knew your athletics career was over?
It was a bit of a slow transition because I kept on trying for probably a good 4 to 6 years after, like, to keep on coming back. And so you've always got that hope there. But in 2004, when I was rehabbing from the surgery, I was training at Monash University gym down in Peninsula campus. And because I was there all the time rehabbing and trying to get my ankle better, they offered me a job to sort of work in the gym there and assist there. And I thought, well, I'm injured. I'm not doing anything for the next 6 months after surgery, so I might as well try and earn a bit of money. As an athlete, as a runner, you pretty much make your money from going on the circuit and running Grand Prix and that type of thing. And if you can't do that, then you've got no income. So thought that was a good idea. So I started working in the gym there. And this is my 20th year at Monash. So I'm still at Monash University now. Wow. Completely different role. Sometimes, those opportunities present themselves that I would never have come across had I not had the injury. And now I've been at Monash for 20 years. Met my wife at Monash, and have 3 kids. So
Right.
that's the slide indoors moment, I guess. And that's you try and look at that positive rather than what I missed out from the injury. Because if I didn't have the injury, then I wouldn't have had that other side of my life.
I suppose you have to be positive, though. You've been to one Olympic Games, which is more than most, and you went to the one in Sydney, a home Olympics. So pretty good one to go to.
It was amazing. And just, things like the walking out for the opening ceremony with 110,000 Australian people there. And I remember Gazy carrying the flag into the stadium. You see him just run in with it. And we were in the tunnel waiting to go out, but the roar that came through the tunnel was unbelievable. Walking around the village and you'd see people like, Lance Armstrong, not 2000, none of this had broken yet. So Lance Armstrong, I just read his book, and you see these people that you'd only ever seen on TV. And the best thing about being in an Olympic Village is you get to see the different sizes and shapes of the athletes, and it is mind-blowing. You see a gigantic weightlifter sitting next to a tiny gymnast, and you get to see those differences and how all these different body shapes and sizes can make up an athlete. So it was fantastic to go to the Olympics, but especially in Sydney. The home crowd was something I will never forget. The noise that they made when they announced me in my lane as running. The roar was just absolutely deafening. And it's something that you'll never forget, and very, very lucky to have got to have that in Sydney. And it was, I think, a bit of a changeover to the Sydney Olympics. There were so many athletes that it was their last Olympics who were a little bit older that had been, hanging on for the 8 years, or not necessarily hanging on, but that had been their goal that they were aiming for. They're like, I'll be 28 or I'll be 30 come the Sydney Olympics, and that had been their goal for the last 8 years. And then there was a whole another generation who was their first Olympics. So Craig Mottram and Benita Willis and these types of athletes, Jana Pittman, that was their first Olympics. So it was a real changeover. And I'm very envious of all the athletes who are going to get to focus on Brisbane in 2032. Because there's nothing like a home Olympics.
So have you still got the Oki uniform, and have you still got your running uniform that you represented Australia in, Kris? I don't know whether the Oki uniform was great, but I can understand why they were going down that path.
Yeah, got all the uniform. It's all in the cupboards somewhere. I've got it all in bags in there, and kept onto it, given some parts of it away to training partners and people who support you during your journey, but kept the majority of it. It's all sitting there in the cupboard, and hopefully your moths aren't eating it, but something to hang on to, and maybe this is a good year to pull out and have a bit of a look at what's in there, because it's probably been sitting in the cupboard for a number of years now.
Now, Kathy Freeman, of course, won gold. She was part of the athletics team. She was probably, if she wasn't captain of the team, she would have been maybe Clayton's captain of the team. We were all hoping she'd win gold medal. She was expected to win the gold medal. What was that feeling like, being part of the team, knowing that all of Australia were, as I say, just expecting her to win that gold medal, and we're all nervous for her?
I think it was nerve-wracking for the entire team, and it was sort of early in the athletics program as well. Her win. So from memory, it was the Monday night. And the athletics started on the Friday and Saturday. So it was early on in the athletics program. I think it would have definitely said, if she didn't win, it would have been demoralising probably for the entire team. But I just can't understand how she was able to perform under the pressure she would have been under. Knowing what I felt as pretty much a nobody going there and competing, compared to what she would have been feeling, it is quite remarkable. And it makes the performance that much more special. It's a lot easier, I think, to win when you're not expected to win, and you can pop up and steal a victory. But when the entire country at a home Olympics is expecting you to win, that is tough, and that makes it that much more special, and something I just can't understand how she was able to perform under that pressure.
Well, that was a huge night.
I do remember as well.
Yep. Go on. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Yep.
The night of the opening ceremony. So I was in the same house in the Olympic Village as Catherine, and we all went off to the opening ceremony together. And she didn't say a word about her lighting the torch or anything like that. I think a couple of people sort of said, "Hey, you got anything to do with the, you're doing anything in the ceremony?" And she just sort of shook her head and said no, and all of that. And she snuck off at one point after we all walked out. A couple of people came and she snuck off at one point. But up until that stage, nobody had any inkling that she was going to be lighting the torch. And so that was a pretty surreal moment as well, that she was in the same house as us and didn't mention anything, but managed to light the torch. And what a lot of people don't know is that she actually got a little bit sick from that, because she was standing in that water for so long when the mechanism got stuck.
Correct.
So for the next week, from when she lit the torch to when she had to compete, she was dealing with a cold as well, on top of all that pressure that she was having to deal with. So it makes it even more unbelievable going into that race, and you're sick and you're making sure that nobody knows you're sick, because you don't want that getting out. Unbelievable performance.
Kris McCarthy, 800-metre runner who represented Australia at the Sydney Olympics in 2000, has joined me, Dan Lonigan. I'm dashing down to Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans. They've got over 25 lenders. They can deal with anyone in Australia. They've got clients in every state and every capital city. Now, that was a huge night, that Monday night, for the athletics team, Kris, because not only did Kathy win gold, Tatiana Grigorieva won silver in the pole vault, and jumping giant Rima, who lived off, I think, a lot of junk food, I believe, and he was a pretty laissez-faire character, performed really well on the long jump. So it was a huge night, wasn't it?
Probably the biggest night that I know of in athletics. Obviously, you've got what Usain achieved in 2008. But there was, even away from Australia, you had Michael Johnson in the 400-metre final, his swan song. You had the 10,000 metres with Gebre Selassie versus Turgat, which is probably one of the greatest distance races you'll ever see. It is a very, very special night of athletics. I would actually like to, because I've only ever seen it live. It'd be great to see if Channel 7 put out the entire night's footage on DVD or something. It'd be great to go back and watch that entire night with all the commentary from Bruce and the team, because it was a special athletics night.
Now, I know, other than obviously your work at Monash, you've been involved, I think, in some local footy teams. I got in touch with you through a great mate of ours, Paddy Swain, who's the coach of the Pines Football Club and the MPFNL. You've been doing some fitness work with them, is that right? And I believe you also play veterans footy and you're dominating. Didn't you win the BNF?
Yeah, a little while ago. So I got invited down to Mornington Football Club by Josh Beard, who was the coach down there at the time as the fitness coach.
Yeah, great bloke.
And so, sorry? Yes. And he got me down. So I was taking the running training and so forth. But in round one, playing the Frankston YCW, he named me in the ruck against a guy called Ash Eames. Because I was the only guy above 6 foot I think they had on their list at that time. So that was a bit of a rude introduction to football, coming up against Australia's strongest man in Ash Eames in the first game for Mornington. So I did play a little bit of in the NPNFL for a couple of years, and since then played some old man's football for the Carrum Cowboys. I'm somewhat retired now, having done my knee yet again. Right. A couple of years ago. So I had some surgery, and the surgeon has strongly suggested I don't play again. We'll see. There's always that temptation to go back and join the boys. But yeah, have been involved in local footy for the last probably 15 years, off and on, at different clubs, helping them out with their fitness training and their running training. So it's always good to be involved in that team spirit. Something you don't get as much as a runner some of the times. You do a lot of your training out there by yourself. In winter, in the cold, you don't necessarily always have that team spirit. So it is fun to be involved in a team environment.
And why middle distance running, Kris? I mean, again, you came into the sport late, as you said, and you quickly became a star at it within a couple of years. It was obviously something you were good at, but why did you choose the 800 metres? And what's the most challenging part of an 800 metre race for an 800 metre runner?
Yeah, I think with most athletes, you don't necessarily choose the event. The event chooses you a lot of the time. A lot of runners start out as 100-meter runners, and you just keep on moving out until you find the distance that you're best at. If you're really good at the 100, you usually stop there and don't bother going any further. I got out to about the 800 before I found that was the event that I was okay at. So, yeah, that's sort of how it worked. I had reasonably good speed and was able to hold that speed for around about 2 minutes. So that's partly why I was probably an 800-meter runner. After that, I didn't have the endurance because I didn't do that running as a kid or as a teenager and hadn't done a lot of the endurance work. So I didn't have the endurance really to run a strong 1500 and probably didn't have the speed to run an out-and-out, really, really quick 400. The other event I might have been okay at would have been the 400 hurdles because I did a bit of hurdling as a kid. But then you got to do all the hurdle training and all of that. So it's easy just to go for it, go and get out there and run. So chose the 800. The hardest part of the 800, I think, is the lactic acid. You're basically having to put up with a lot of lactic acid. It is close to being a sprint the whole way. If we're going for a fast time or the guys are going for a fast time in an 800, they're usually going through in 50 seconds, sometimes even quicker. So to give you an idea, when Freeman won that Olympics 400 metres, she ran 49.1, I believe it was. Yeah. So basically what she ran for the 400 is what the men are going through if they're going for a fast time for that first lap. So you've already got the lactic acid starting to build up. The last 300 metres, you're just trying to hang on. Often when you're watching a race on TV, it might look like the winner is sprinting away from the rest. Usually what's happening in an 800 is they're actually slowing down. The people behind them are just slowing down more quickly than they are. So the person who's able to hold their speed the most is usually the one coming through at the end. Changes a little bit if it's one of those really slow tactical races. They might increase their speed a little bit. But in a fast race, usually you're just hanging on. And for myself, after every race, I'd get really, really sick. I'd throw up for, half an hour, 40 minutes after a race, get migraines, just from the toll it took on my body, the oxygen debt you go into. And probably because I didn't do enough of the long training, the endurance training. I was always probably pushing myself a little bit harder than what my body was able to handle.
And before I let you go, Kris, what would you do if you had the opportunity now to represent Australia at the Olympic Games? What would you do differently now compared to 2000? Obviously, different training methods, etc. It's a long time ago when you think back 24 years, and that is a lifetime in sport, isn't it? A double lifetime, really.
Yeah. Probably the main thing is being Tweety, you're a kid sort of, and I didn't have that, I guess, knowledge that this is really special at the time. I was still acting like a 20-year-old, even though I was at the Olympics. So I was still going out with mates and, having a few beers at the pub and eating McDonald's and Hungry Jack's and fast food for dinners because I was improving so much so quickly. I was like, well, this is working. I'm just going to keep on doing it. So I probably at that first Olympics wasn't, crossing every T and dotting every I as much as what I could have been. And, that was a bit of that, I guess, being young and you just think, this is going to last forever. I've got ages. And, so I was enjoying life a little bit too much. Mm-hmm. And had I known that would have been my one and only Olympics, in hindsight, I probably would have, made those little changes, I think. And, been a little bit more focused on the running, a little less focused with catching up with my mates.
And we touched previously on Athletics Australia, which has its issues at times. Do you think the sport of athletics is in good shape in this country?
I think the talent that we have at the moment, especially in the middle and to long distances, is in good shape. I think the sport overall, not just in Australia, but overall in the world, is on a bit of a decline. I mean, we really do need to have a look at ways we can, bring along the kids along for the ride and get them more involved in the sport. We've seen other sports make massive changes, whether it be 2020 in cricket. But a lot of other sports have been able to, I guess, reinvent themselves and get a whole new generation of viewers. Athletics, I think, really needs to do that at the moment. Outside of the Olympic Games, maybe the Commonwealths, maybe the World Championships, athletics isn't getting the coverage that it used to. And there's not the people watching it that used to watch it. So how can we try and get more people interested in athletics again?
Kris, it's been a great pleasure to chat to you. You've got a great story. I really wish for you that you got more opportunities to compete at more Olympic Games, but you did win a bronze medal at the Commonwealth Games in 2002. And by the way, where does that sit? Is it in the sock drawer or is it in the pool room, the medal?
It's in the study. It's in the study here. It's just over to my left. I had a look before to see if I knew where it was. Did lose it for a little while, but we found it again. At some point it got lost.
Just on that, what was it?
It's under the couch. So I think I'd been to a.
What was that moment like? I mean, to win a medal at the Commonwealth Games is nothing to sneeze about either, is it?
No, it was. I think I learned a little bit from the Sydney Olympics. So I did actually tore my hamstring twice going into the Commonwealth Games in Manchester as well. Hadn't had an injury for the 2 years since the Olympics, and then right before the Commonwealth Games, re-injured my hamstring again. And that might be that you're really trying to push everything to get yourself in the best possible shape. So I had to do a fitness test right before the Commonwealth Games. I wasn't allowed to leave Darwin until I got a certain time in a time trial. But the lessons I've learned from the Olympics and from that heat of not making it through, was that I actually had to just believe in myself regardless if I hadn't had the perfect preparation, and went into that race a lot more positively and managed to come out with the bronze medal. So I think that was just all around mindset more than anything. And as you do get older, I think you do realise that it's very rare for everything to go perfect in your preparations. You just got to make the most of it. But when you're a little bit younger, as soon as something comes up that isn't the way you want it, you do get very stressed about that. Manchester was great in that I was, able to learn from Sydney and get something out of it.
Well, Kris, congratulations on a great career. All the very best going forward. It's been a delight chatting to you about your story. It's a wonderful story too. Won Olympic Games, but it was Sydney 2000. Couldn't be much better than that. And thanks for joining us on Dashing Dan's Olympic Adventures for Aussie Home Loans, where their areas of expertise include purchasing a property, owner-occupied or investment, building a property portfolio, refinancing, debt consolidation, cash out, construction, pre-approvals, first home buyers, equipment loans, car loans and personal loans. And they've got over 25 lenders. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Dan.